The sound came first, a short, cutting burst that cracked through the solemn air like glass splintering on marble. Justice William Alsup laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh that fills a room with warmth. It was a smirk in sound form, a low tremor of superiority rolling down from the bench. His robe rustled as he leaned back, lips curling in something between amusement and disdain. Across the courtroom, every head turned toward the source of that sound, unsure if they had truly heard what they just heard. For a moment, time slowed. The clerk's pen stopped moving. Reporters shifted in their seats. The echo of that laugh lingered like an insult that refused to fade. At the center of it all stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, steady, still unblinking. Her hands rested lightly on the podium, her posture unshaken. But behind her calm eyes, something stirred. She had faced worse before: condescension dressed as courtesy, disrespect wrapped in legal jargon, but this felt different. This was public. This was power-mocking principle. Alsup's chuckle wasn't just about a point of law. It was about who was allowed to speak with authority and who wasn't. The judge adjusted his glasses, voice dripping with confidence as he added, "Counselor, that's quite a theory." Another chuckle. A few in the gallery exchanged glances, unsure whether to join in or recoil. Crockett didn't flinch. Her silence became the loudest sound in the room. A hush spread, thin and electric. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. Every eye waited for her response. Every breath held in the balance, and as the laughter died against the marble walls, the tension began to take its place. Something was about to shift, but no one in that courtroom, not even Justice Alsup, could have predicted what Jasmine Crockett would say next. To understand that moment, you have to understand the battlefield it was fought on. This wasn't a petty exchange over courtroom etiquette. It was a clash over who gets to define fairness in America. The case before Justice Alsup centered on federal oversight, the kind that could redraw invisible lines of accountability. It was about whether certain agencies, long shielded by precedent, could continue operating beyond the scrutiny of the very people they served. For most, it was a technical issue, buried under motions and statutes. For Jasmine Crockett, it was a question of principle. Who watches the powerful when the powerful refuse to be watched? Alsup had built a reputation for intellect so sharp, it sometimes cut those who dared stand too close. He had no patience for idealists, as he called them, or for what he labeled emotional advocacy. His courtroom was a temple of order, and he, the unchallenged high priest, when he laughed, it wasn't just at one woman, it was at the audacity of anyone who thought the scales of justice could be tilted by courage alone. But Crockett was no stranger to that tone. She had heard it in city halls, in newsrooms, on debate stages, where the powerful hid behind their titles. She had learned early that arrogance often dresses itself as intellect, that the sneer of the privileged is really fear in disguise. Her calm wasn't submission, it was strategy. The same composure that had carried her through law school while working nights, that had steadied her voice when others tried to drown it out, now stood unshaken before a man who thought laughter could end an argument. This moment was bigger than one courtroom. It was the sound of old power defending its walls. It was the reflex of a system that scoffs when truth refuses to bow. But what Alsup didn't see, what no one yet understood, is that the balance of power had already started to shift. Because when dignity stands against derision, even marble can crack. But this wasn't the first time power mocked justice, and it wouldn't be the last. Because Jasmine Crockett was about to turn that smirk into silence. William Alsup was the kind of man who carried authority the way others carried breath, effortlessly, instinctively, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For decades, he had ruled from the bench with a reputation forged in intellect and tempered by intimidation. Lawyers entering his courtroom knew the unspoken rule: you didn't just argue your case, you survived his scrutiny. His questions were designed not merely to test logic, but to expose weakness. He could dismantle an argument with a single raised brow, a half-smile that warned you he'd already found the flaw you hadn't noticed. Too many? He was a symbol of the old guard, brilliant, unyielding, and utterly convinced that the law was a fortress, not a bridge. His judgments were crisp, technical, precise. Emotion was an intruder in his domain. Those who appealed to fairness instead of precedent were dismissed with that same sardonic patience, that same measured voice that said, "Feelings don't belong here." He believed in hierarchy and order. In the quiet dominance of intellect over empathy, colleagues spoke of him with a kind of wary respect. "Alsup doesn't lose control," one clerk once said. "He is control." Reporters loved the spectacle of his wit, the way he could make a seasoned attorney stammer. He was theater in robes, the embodiment of a system that prizes composure over compassion. And yet, beneath the accolades and the endless citations, there was something colder, an unspoken belief that his command of the law made him immune to error. He was As one commentator described, a man who'd long mistaken authority for truth. Authority was the natural order, the proof of one's correctness. When he spoke, others listened. When he ruled, others obeyed. That was how the world had always worked in his mind until the day Jasmine Crockett stood before him and refused to flinch. Where Alsup was marble, Crockett was movement. His power came from position. Hers came from purpose. His certainty was built on precedent. Hers was built on experience. He dismissed human struggle as anecdotal, while she understood it as the heart of justice itself. In another era, his confidence would have been celebrated as wisdom, but times were changing. The public was beginning to question the sanctity of that bench. To see the cracks in the cold perfection of the system it represented, Alsup didn't notice, or maybe he refused to. He still believed his word was the final one, but beneath the gavel's echo and the marble silence, something was shifting because this time, his opponent wasn't there to win favor. She was there to make history. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin in marble hallways or under the glow of courtroom lights. It began on the South Side, where ambition had to fight through noise and struggle just to be heard. She grew up watching her community navigate the daily grind of inequity: mothers working double shifts, fathers denied second chances, children learning early that rules weren't always written for everyone. Those streets didn't teach her despair. They taught her defiance. Her mother, a nurse who never missed a night shift, used to tell her, "Don't just get smart, get steady." Her father, a quiet man with rough hands, reminded her that integrity was the one thing no one could take. She carried those lessons into every classroom that doubted her, every lecture hall where her presence felt like protest. Law school wasn't just an education, it was resistance. While others memorized cases to pass exams, she studied them to understand power, to see how laws could either heal or harm, depending on who held the pen. The doors didn't open easily. She had professors who looked at her name and assumed she was in the wrong room. She had peers who smiled politely, then dismissed her ideas as too emotional. But she learned to turn those moments into fuel. She worked nights to afford her textbooks, interned with public defenders who handled the cases no one else wanted, and stood beside clients who didn't have a dollar to their name but still deserved a voice. Every motion she filed, every argument she made carried a piece of that Southside resilience. To her, justice wasn't an abstraction. It was survival, dignity, and the unshakable belief that truth, when spoken, carried its own authority. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She needed to stand, to look power in the eye, and refuse to shrink. By the time she entered Congress, she had already learned the secret that many in Washington never would: that respect isn't granted by title, and fear is often just power's disguise. She carried herself with a grace that made arrogance look small, the conviction that made cynicism feel hollow. So when Justice Alsup laughed that day, Jasmine Crockett wasn't offended. She was awakened. The silence that followed Alsup's laughter was the kind that hums with voltage. Every person in that courtroom felt a tan, invisible tremor running under the benches. Through the polished wood, across the marble floor, Jasmine Crockett lifted her eyes from the papers before her, her movements unhurried, almost a calm. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of restraint, a melody of reason that cut through the aftershock of condescension. "Your Honor," again. Her tone deliberate, every word measured like the ticking of a clock. If the law exists only for the powerful to interpret, then it no longer serves the people it was written to protect. A murmur rippled through the gallery. It wasn't defiance. Not yet. It was poise. A quiet reminder that respect was not silence. Alsup's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, voice low, the hint of a smirk still resting on his lips. "Congresswoman," said, "you may find that passion clouds judgment. This is a court of law, not a campaign rally." The jab landed like a slap cloaked in civility. A few reporters glanced at each other, fingers hesitating over keyboards. But Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes met his not in challenge, but in clarity. "Then perhaps, Your Honor," she replied, "we should ask why justice feels more political than ever." Gasps, a rustle. The courtroom seemed to inhale all at once. Alsup's hand froze mid-motion, fingers hovering over the gavel as if even he couldn't decide whether to strike it or stay silent. The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, a reminder that the world beyond those walls was listening. He tried to interrupt again, voice clipped, authoritative. "You're treading close to contempt, counselor." Her answer came softly, unhurried. "I'm treading close to truth." It wasn't the volume that held the room, it was the control. Every word she spoke landed like a chisel against stone, steady, unrelenting. The reporters stopped typing altogether. Even the clerk, usually mechanical in her precision, sat frozen, eyes darting between the two of them as though watching a storm build in slow motion. Crockett continued, outlining her argument with precision, how precedent had been twisted to protect privilege, how oversight had become a shield for those who should be held accountable. Her voice didn't rise. It expanded, filling the room until even Alsup, seemed to shrink beneath its calm certainty. He interrupted once more, louder this time, his tone bordering on exasperation. "You are implying misconduct where none exists." She didn't blink. "No, Your Honor. I'm implying humanity where it's been forgotten." The words struck deeper than any accusation. It was the kind of line that didn't need a gavel to make its impact. For a fleeting second, the judge faltered, his gaze breaking from hers. It was as if the air itself recognized the shift, the exact moment when intellect bowed, however briefly, to integrity. Around the room, something intangible changed. The spectators leaned forward, sensing history stretching out before them like a held breath. The tension no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to possibility. And then, with just 12 words, Jasmine Crockett flipped the entire courtroom on its head. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Jasmine Crockett stood still, eyes fixed on Justice Alsup, her expression unreadable. The air around her seemed to tighten, thick with anticipation. Then she drew a slow breath and began, not loud, not defiant, but calm, anchored in clarity. "Your Honor," she said, her tone steady, "this court has long upheld that the rule of law is blind. Yet too often, it turns its head when the powerful stand before it." A murmur stirred. She went on, citing precedent after precedent cases Alsup himself had ruled on. Decisions where his logic bent conveniently toward authority, where compassion had been deemed irrelevant to justice. Her words were surgical, each one an incision, revealing the contradiction beneath the robe. "In one ruling," she said, glancing briefly at her notes, "you stated that discretion was the court's sacred trust. In another, you called mercy a dangerous indulgence. So, which is it, Your Honor? Is justice flexible enough for power, but too rigid for the powerless?" The gallery shifted. A clerk's pen slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a small metallic sound that rang louder than it should have. Alsup's hand twitched toward his gavel, but he didn't strike. His face had changed, still composed, but less certain, the edges of confidence beginning to blur. Crockett continued, voice deepening, building like a slow tide. "When the law becomes a shield for those who mock it, it ceases to serve. The bench loses meaning when it forgets who built it. The people. In the moment a judge laughs at truth, justice itself is on trial." Her tone sharpened, not angry, but resolute. "You asked if I confuse passion for judgment. I don't. But I do recognize when judgment is mistaken for superiority. I came here to argue a case, not to be patronized by the sound of my own government's laughter." The last sentence hit with the weight of decades, the echoes of every condescending smirk she'd endured, every dismissal wrapped in civility. Alsop's composure wavered. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. And then, after a beat of silence, so pure it seemed sacred, Jasmine Crockett delivered the line that would live far beyond the walls of that courtroom. "If justice is blind, Your Honor," she said quietly, "then perhaps it's time someone helped it see." The words fell like a verdict. A collective exhale rippled through the room's soft gasps, stunned stillness, the sound of awe disguised as silence. The clerk looked up, eyes wide. Reporters began scribbling furiously, their pens racing to capture what history had just whispered. Even the judge's gavel remained motionless, its authority suspended in air. For the first time, the marble walls did not feel cold. They felt awake. The laughter that had started it all had turned into something else entirely, reckoning. But outside that courtroom, her words would echo far beyond the marble walls and ignite something no one expected by nightfall. The clip had already escaped the courtroom. Someone in the gallery had captured the moment Alsup's laughter, Crockett's calm stare, and those 12 words that seemed to pierce the air itself. Within hours, it was everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, late-night cable. The hashtags multiplied like wildfire. Hashtag Crockett claps back. Hashtag judicial bias. Hashtag power and pride. The video wasn't just trending. It was spreading like a pulse through a restless nation hungry for something real. On one side of the screen, news anchors replayed the footage with theatrical gravity. Frame by frame, their voices tinged with awe. "A Congresswoman's defiant stand against judicial arrogance," one declared. On another channel, conservative pundits scowled, accusing her of grandstanding, of disrespecting the sanctity of the bench. Their outrage only fed the momentum. Every insult became fuel. Every attempt to diminish her only made her presence larger. Law professors took 2 podcasts and live streams, unpacking every syllable of the exchange. "She didn't just challenge precedent," one said. "She exposed the power dynamic that hides behind it." A viral TikTok stitched together her words with images of suffragettes, civil rights marches, immigrant families holding up court documents like passports to belonging. For millions watching, this wasn't about one woman versus one judge. It was about what happens when dignity refuses to bow. Everyday people weighed in. A teacher in Detroit tweeted, "My students just watched Jasmine Crockett hold her ground. I saw their eyes light up. They finally saw what courage looks like in real time." Young lawyer in Los Angeles posted, She said what so many of us have wanted to say when power laughs in our faces. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist. One opened his monologue with, "When Justice Alsup laughed, he thought he was ending the argument. Turns out, he was starting a movement." Laughter, this time, belonged to the people. In the following days, the clip became something more than viral. It became symbolic. For some, it was proof that justice could still speak truth to itself. For others, it was a warning that the old hierarchies were cracking. Headlines screamed, "The laugh heard across America." Editorials asked whether the judiciary was truly immune from bias. And on college campuses, students quoted Crockett's line, "If justice is blind, then perhaps it's time someone helped it see," as though it were scripture. But beneath the noise, there was something deeper, quieter, a national reckoning humming under the surface. People weren't just watching the clip, they were watching themselves in it. The disbelief, the defiance, the composure, it all felt like a mirror reflecting the larger struggle for respect in a world that still measured worth by pedigree. And while the pundits fought for airtime and the headlines burned hot, Jasmine Crockett stayed silent, refusing to feed the frenzy. She knew something the rest of the country hadn't yet realized, because while the nation debated the fallout, Jasmine Crockett was already thinking beyond the headlines. Days later, Jasmine Crockett stood before a sea of microphones, flashbulbs flickering like restless stars. The air was thick with anticipation, but her face was calm, her voice steady. She didn't gloat. She didn't revisit the laughter, or the tension, or the silence that followed. Instead, she spoke softly, each word grounded in conviction. "This was never about me," she began. "It was about how we speak to one another when the stakes are highest. About remembering that disagreement doesn't give us permission to dismiss dignity." Her tone rose, not in anger, but in purpose. "We can't let arrogance define justice," she said. "Because when power laughs at truth, it's not just one person being mocked. It's every person who still believes this country can live up to its ideals." As she turned to leave, a journalist called out, asking if she had any regrets. She paused, then smiled faintly. "No," she said. "Dignity wins in the end." And as the cameras faded and the courtroom emptied, one truth remained. Respect isn't demanded, it's demonstrated. Justice William Alsup laughed, but Jasmine Crockett's words shut him down. What began as a moment of arrogance became a turning point, a reminder that humility still has the power to silence hubris. Across the country, people replayed that exchange not because it was dramatic, but because it felt honest. It reminded us that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to bow. So the question now is ours to answer. When power laughs at truth, what do? Do we look away or do we stand our ground, steady and unshaken, just like she did? If you believe that courage still matters, share this story. If you believe that dignity deserves a voice, add yours. Subscribe, comment, and be part of the movement that reminds America. Real power is respect, and it begins with us.